Title: My basement has stairs that lead somewhere else. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. Most houses hide secrets in plain sight. Cracks in the walls. Sounds in the night. But some secrets aren't meant to be found at all. This story isn't about ghosts that scream or monsters that chase. It's about a staircase that should not exist, a descent that rewrites reality, and a man who realized too late that some basements don't go down, they go elsewhere. Subscribe and listen carefully. The house had never felt new even on the day he bought it. It sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood where the streets curved unnaturally, as if designed to avoid something buried beneath them. Built sometime in the early 1950s, the structure looked ordinary enough from the outside. 2 stories, faded white siding, a shallow front porch that creaked under the weight of time rather than neglect. The inspection report came back clean. The price was low. Too low in hindsight, but desperation has a way of blinding reason. Ethan moved in alone. Recently divorced, recently relocated, recently exhausted by a life that felt like it had been quietly dismantled while he wasn't paying attention. The house offered silence, and silence felt like mercy. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. He unpacked, set up his home office, learned the rhythm of the place. Pipes groaned at night. The floors complained when he walked too quickly. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening. The basement was unfinished. Concrete walls, exposed beams, a single pull cord dangling from the ceiling light. It smelled faintly of damp earth and old dust, the kind of smell every basement seemed to share. He stored boxes down there and rarely lingered. The staircase leading down was narrow and steep, 13 steps exactly, ending at the cold concrete floor. He counted them once out of idle curiosity and then forgot about it. The first change was subtle. Ethan noticed it one evening after returning home later than usual. The basement light was on. He stood at the top of the stairs and stared down. He was certain he had turned it off that morning. He always did. Electricity wasn't cheap, and habits formed easily when life felt out of control. He told himself it was nothing. Muscle memory failing. A momentary lapse. He pulled the cord, shut off the light, and went upstairs without another thought. 2 days later it happened again. This time he paused longer. The light cast shadows up the stairwell, elongating the steps in a way that made the descent seem deeper than it should have been. He felt a flicker of unease, small enough to dismiss but persistent enough to remember. He turned the light off again, more deliberately this time, and stood there for several seconds before leaving, listening for something he couldn't name. Nothing happened. The third time, the light wasn't the only thing that had changed. Ethan was carrying a box of old books down to the basement when he stopped halfway down the stairs. The air felt heavier, cooler. The smell had changed. It was still damp, but layered with something else, something mineral and sharp, like stone freshly cut or soil exposed after rain. He reached the bottom step and froze. There were more stairs. Where the concrete floor should have been, there was another staircase descending into darkness. Narrower than the first. Older. The steps were made of rough stone, uneven and worn at the center, as if countless feet had passed over them. The basement light illuminated only the first few steps before the darkness swallowed the rest. Ethan stood motionless, his mind scrambling to correct what his eyes were seeing. Basements didn't do this. Houses didn't grow staircases. He felt a surge of vertigo, the sensation that the room had subtly shifted while he wasn't looking. He set the box down slowly, afraid sudden movement might make the vision collapse or solidify. He checked the walls, the beams, the ceiling. Everything else looked the same. The original basement hadn't changed. Only the floor was wrong. He backed away and climbed the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. At the top, he turned and looked again. The stone staircase was gone. The basement floor was bare concrete, cracked in familiar places, the light pooling harmlessly across it. No opening. No descent. Just a basement. Ethan laughed once, sharp and humorless. He told himself it was stress. Fatigue. The mind filling gaps with nonsense when left alone too long. He avoided the basement for the rest of the night. Sleep came poorly. His dreams were restless, filled with images of depth and weight, of spaces that folded inward endlessly. He woke before dawn with the impression of having been watched, though the house remained silent and unchanged. The following day he worked from home, deliberately grounding himself in routine. Emails, calls, deadlines. The normal structure of a life he was trying to rebuild. By evening, the memory of the staircase felt distant, unreal, embarrassing even. He decided to confront it head-on. At exactly 9 o'clock, he went to the basement. The light came on. The concrete floor was intact. No stairs. No opening. He exhaled slowly, tension bleeding from his shoulders. He stood there for several minutes, forcing himself to look, to accept what was real. The house was old, not impossible. His mind had played a trick, nothing more. He turned to leave. And then he noticed the scuff marks. They were faint, visible only at a certain angle, etched into the concrete where the floor met the far wall. Parallel lines, shallow grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly across the same path. They didn't lead anywhere obvious. They simply stopped. Ethan knelt to examine them. The marks were old, not recent. Dust had settled into them over time, softening their edges. They weren't his. He had never moved anything heavy enough to make them. A chill crept up his spine. He stood and left the basement, locking the door behind him even though there was no reason to. The lock clicked into place with a finality he didn't like. That night the house sounded different. Not louder. Not quieter. Different. The creaks and pops he had grown accustomed to were replaced by a deeper, slower settling, as if the structure itself were shifting under its own weight. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths. At some point he heard something else. Footsteps. They were distant, irregular, echoing faintly from below. Not on the basement stairs he knew, but deeper. Hollower. As though someone were walking far beneath the house, each step reverberating through layers of stone and earth. Ethan didn't move. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call out. He listened until the sound faded, leaving behind a silence that felt thicker than before. The next morning he found the basement door unlocked. He knew he had locked it. He tested the latch, the frame. Nothing was broken. Nothing forced. The door had simply been opened and closed again. Against his better judgment, Ethan went downstairs. The stone staircase was there. It yawned open where the concrete floor should have been, wider this time, the darkness beyond it deeper, more absolute. The basement light flickered once, then steadied, illuminating the first 10 steps before failing to penetrate further. Ethan's heart pounded. He felt an irrational certainty that the staircase was waiting for him, that it had always been there and he was the one who had been blind to it. He leaned forward, peering down, straining to see an end. There wasn't one. The steps curved slightly as they descended, disappearing into a shadow that felt solid, almost tangible. The air rising from below was cold and carried that same mineral scent, stronger now, layered with something faintly metallic. Ethan backed away. He didn't go down. Not then. He didn't try to touch the steps or throw something into the darkness. He retreated, closed the basement door, and spent the rest of the day in a state of brittle alertness. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should have been. He researched the house that night. Property records. Old permits. Newspaper archives. There was nothing unusual. No renovations unaccounted for. No mention of underground structures. The land had been empty before the house was built. Ordinary. Which made it worse. Over the next week, the staircase appeared and disappeared unpredictably. Sometimes it was there in the morning and gone by evening. Sometimes it vanished for days, leaving behind only the scuffed concrete and the lingering smell of stone. Ethan stopped inviting people over. He stopped sleeping properly. The house felt unstable, as if its dimensions were no longer fixed. The sounds returned. Footsteps below. Sometimes heavier. Sometimes lighter. Always out of reach. Ethan began to feel watched even when he was alone in a room with the door closed. Not seen exactly. Measured. As if something beneath the house were aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. One night, he stood at the top of the basement stairs and stared down at the opening. The stone steps glistened faintly, damp with unseen moisture. The darkness beyond them felt intentional, not the absence of light but its rejection. He told himself he needed answers. And for the first time since the staircase appeared, Ethan took a step down. Ethan's foot settled onto the first stone step with a hesitation that felt physical, as though the air itself resisted the contact. The stone was colder than he expected, colder than the basement concrete above, and faintly damp. The texture was rough beneath his shoe, uneven in a way that suggested age far beyond the house itself. He waited for something to happen. For the step to crumble, or for the darkness below to surge upward in response to his presence. Nothing did. He took another step. The basement light above him flickered, dimming for a fraction of a second before stabilizing again. Ethan paused, glancing back over his shoulder. The familiar space of the basement looked smaller from here, the ceiling lower, the walls closer together. The opening in the floor framed it like a photograph from a past life. He continued downward. With each step, the air grew heavier, denser, pressing against his skin with a faint resistance that made breathing feel slightly laborious. The smell intensified. Stone, earth, rust. Beneath it all, a subtle undertone he couldn't immediately place, something organic and old. The staircase curved gently to the right, preventing him from seeing more than a few steps ahead at any given moment. By the time he reached what he guessed was the 20th step, the light from above had faded to a dull glow. Shadows clung to the walls, thick and uneven, swallowing the edges of his vision. Ethan forced himself to keep moving, counting each step in his head to anchor himself to something rational. 21, 22, 23. The staircase showed no sign of ending. A strange sense of displacement crept over him, the unnerving impression that he was no longer beneath his house at all. The depth felt wrong. No residential basement could extend this far without intersecting utilities, foundations, or bedrock. Yet the stone steps continued, worn smooth at their centers, suggesting long and frequent use. Used by what he didn't want to consider. Ethan stopped and listened. The silence here was not absolute. It was layered. Beneath the quiet, there was a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as though something vast were moving very slowly in the distance. He felt it more than heard it, a subtle tremor that traveled up through the stone and into his bones. He swallowed and continued. At step 47, the staircase finally leveled out. The space it opened into was not a room in any conventional sense. It was vast, its boundaries lost in darkness, the ceiling high enough that Ethan couldn't see it even when he tilted his head back. The floor beneath his feet was stone, smoother here, polished by time or passage. The walls, where they could be seen, were irregular, not constructed so much as carved. The air was colder still, carrying that metallic tang more strongly now. Ethan stood at the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The opening behind him, the staircase leading up, looked narrower than it had moments ago, the light above reduced to a distant, anemic glow. He had the unsettling sense that if he lingered too long, it might vanish entirely. He stepped into the space. The sound of his movement echoed outward, distorted and delayed, as if the cavern absorbed and reshaped noise before releasing it. The echoes did not return cleanly. They fractured, overlapping in a way that made it difficult to tell where they were coming from. As his eyes adjusted, details emerged from the darkness. The floor was etched with shallow grooves similar to the scuff marks he had seen in the basement, but on a much larger scale. Long, sweeping arcs intersected and overlapped, worn into the stone by something heavy dragged repeatedly across it. Some grooves were fresher than others, their edges sharper, the stone dust not yet fully settled. Ethan's pulse quickened. Near the center of the space, something rose from the floor. At first, he thought it was a pillar, a natural stone formation left uncut. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into something more deliberate. A structure. Roughly cylindrical, composed of stacked stone slabs fused together in a way that suggested intentional design rather than geology. Its surface was etched with markings, shallow lines and symbols that caught the light at odd angles. They were not decorative. The markings formed patterns that repeated with subtle variations, spirals intersected by jagged lines, shapes that suggested movement rather than form. Looking at them too long made Ethan's eyes ache, his head swimming with a faint pressure behind his temples. He looked away, fighting a sudden wave of nausea. Around the base of the structure lay scattered objects half embedded in the stone floor. Fragments of wood, rusted metal, scraps of fabric so decayed they were barely recognizable. These were not rocks fallen from above. They were remnants. Things that had been brought here. Ethan knelt and touched one of the metal fragments. It flaked beneath his fingers, collapsing into reddish dust. He recoiled, wiping his hand on his jeans, a creeping horror settling in his chest. This place had been used. The low vibration intensified, resolving into something closer to a rhythm. A slow, uneven pulse that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. With each beat, the air shifted slightly as though the cavern were breathing. Ethan backed away from the central structure, his thoughts racing. This was impossible. This was beneath a suburban house. There were no records, no explanations. Yet the evidence was undeniable, tangible beneath his hands and feet. He turned toward the darkness beyond the structure. Something moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible, a slight distortion in the shadows at the far edge of the space. Ethan froze, every muscle locking in place. He stared, straining to make sense of what he was seeing. The darkness moved again, this time more distinctly. It flowed rather than stepped, a slow, deliberate shift that suggested mass without clear form. The vibration grew stronger, syncing with Ethan's heartbeat until it was impossible to tell which was which. He took a step backward. The sound of stone grinding against stone filled the space. Behind him, the staircase shuddered. Ethan spun around in time to see the opening begin to change. The edges of the stairwell rippled, the stone flexing as though it were soft clay rather than solid rock. The steps themselves seemed to stretch, elongating, their angles subtly shifting. The way back was changing. Panic surged, sharp and overwhelming. Ethan ran for the staircase, his footsteps echoing wildly. As he reached the first step, the vibration spiked, a deep, resonant thrum that rattled his teeth. He climbed. The steps felt longer now, higher, forcing his muscles to strain. The light above flickered erratically, flaring and dimming in rapid succession. With each step, the air grew heavier, thicker, clinging to him like wet fabric. Halfway up, the sound came again. Footsteps. Not his. They echoed from below, deliberate and measured, each impact sending a tremor through the stone. Ethan did not look back. He climbed faster, lungs burning, legs shaking. The footsteps followed, unhurried but relentless, their rhythm steady and precise. The staircase seemed to resist him, the stone slick beneath his hands when he reached out for balance. The markings etched into the walls blurred as he passed, twisting subtly, their shapes shifting in ways that made his vision swim. The footsteps grew louder. At the top of the stairs, the basement light flared brightly, illuminating the concrete floor above like a lifeline. Ethan surged forward, hauling himself up the final steps and onto solid ground. The moment his feet hit the basement floor, the sound stopped. The staircase behind him shuddered once, then collapsed inward, the stone flowing and folding until the opening sealed itself seamlessly. In its place was bare concrete, cracked and dusty, indistinguishable from the rest of the floor. Ethan lay there, gasping, his heart hammering in his chest. The basement was silent. The air smelled of dust and damp earth, nothing more. For a long time he did not move. When he finally forced himself upright, his body ached as though he had run for miles. His hands were scraped and bleeding in shallow lines, the skin torn by rough stone. He stared at them, grounding himself in the pain. It had been real. Over the following days, Ethan tried to leave. The first attempt ended when his car refused to start. The second time, the engine turned over but died the moment he reached the end of the driveway. On the third attempt, he made it 2 blocks before a sudden, inexplicable dizziness forced him to pull over. The sensation passed the moment he turned back toward the house. Each time the house waited. The staircase did not reappear immediately. For nearly a week, the basement remained unchanged, its concrete floor unbroken. Ethan slept poorly, haunted by the memory of the cavern and the sense of something vast and aware beneath his feet. Then the dreams began. He dreamed of walking endless stone corridors that curved back on themselves no matter how far he traveled. Of markings carved into every surface, their patterns shifting when he wasn't looking. Of a central structure that pulsed slowly, patiently, waiting. He woke each time with a lingering impression of having been called. On the 7th night, the basement light turned on by itself. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, staring down. The opening was there again, wider than before, the stone steps descending into that impossible darkness. The air rising from below felt expectant, charged with a tension that made his skin prickle. This time he did not hesitate. Something deep within him understood that the descent was no longer optional. The house was no longer merely hiding the staircase. It was offering it. Ethan stepped down, and the darkness welcomed him like something that had been waiting all along. The second descent felt different from the first the moment Ethan placed his foot on the stone. There was no resistance this time. No hesitation from the air, no subtle warning pressed into his bones. The staircase accepted him immediately, as though his presence had been anticipated, prepared for. The stone beneath his shoes was warmer now, faintly slick, and the smell rising from below carried a new note beneath the earth and rust. Something organic. Something alive. The light from the basement above dimmed faster than before. By the time Ethan reached the 5th step, it was already reduced to a dull, distant glow, and by the 10th it was gone entirely. Darkness surrounded him, thick and complete, broken only by a faint ambient illumination that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The markings along the walls glimmered softly, their shifting patterns providing just enough visibility to continue. Ethan descended without counting. Time felt distorted here. Each step blurred into the next, his sense of progression untethered from any reliable measure. The staircase curved and twisted, occasionally branching into short landings that led nowhere before rejoining the main descent. The architecture defied logic, space folding inward on itself in ways that made his head ache if he tried to understand it too deeply. The vibration was stronger now. No longer a distant pulse, it thrummed steadily through the stone, through the air, through him. It felt synchronized with something immense and slow, a presence so large it could afford patience. When the staircase finally ended, the cavern opened before him once more. But it had changed. The vast space beneath the house was brighter, bathed in a low, diffuse glow that emanated from the markings carved into every surface. The floor, walls, and ceiling pulsed faintly in unison, the patterns shifting like living things beneath translucent skin. The central structure loomed larger than before, its cylindrical form taller, broader, its surface crawling with fresh etchings that looked newly carved. Ethan stepped forward, drawn by a force he no longer fought. The remnants scattered around the structure were more numerous now. Shapes resolved into recognizable objects. Fragments of furniture, splintered beams, rusted tools, and scraps of clothing in styles spanning decades. Some were recent. Others were ancient. All were partially absorbed into the stone floor, as though the place were slowly consuming them. Consuming everything brought into it. The realization settled heavily in Ethan's chest. This place was not beneath the house by coincidence. The house was above it because it needed to be. A cover. A lure. A thin, familiar skin stretched over something profoundly wrong. The vibration intensified as he approached the structure, resolving into a rhythm that felt deliberate, expectant. Ethan noticed then that the grooves etched into the floor formed paths. Not random arcs, but converging lines that all led toward the base of the structure. Countless tracks overlapping, worn smooth by repetition. A history of movement, of offerings brought again and again to the same destination. He reached the base of the structure and placed his hand against its surface. The stone was warm. Not the residual warmth of trapped air or geothermal activity, but something closer to body heat. Beneath his palm he felt motion. Slow, deliberate shifting like muscle contracting beneath skin. The structure responded to his touch. The markings flared brighter and the vibration surged, filling the cavern with a deep, resonant hum that rattled Ethan's teeth and blurred his vision. He staggered back, overwhelmed by a sudden influx of sensation that did not feel entirely his own. Images flooded his mind. Not visions exactly, but impressions layered atop one another. Endless staircases descending through centuries of stone. Houses built and rebuilt above the same point. People drawn downward by curiosity, desperation, or subtle influence they mistook for their own thoughts. Each descent feeding something ancient and patient. Ethan understood then that the staircase was not an anomaly. It was an organ. A conduit designed to guide life downward, to deliver it where it was needed. The house was merely the latest vessel grown around it, a temporary shell that would eventually be abandoned, decay, or be replaced. The structure below endured. The hum shifted, deepening, and the space around Ethan seemed to contract slightly, the walls inching closer as though the cavern were focusing its attention on him alone. He turned toward the darkness beyond the central structure. It was no longer empty. The shadows there had thickened, coalescing into a shape that resisted clear definition. It was vast, occupying more space than seemed possible, its boundaries blurring and reforming as it moved. There was no single form to it, no stable outline the mind could cling to. Instead, it suggested itself through absence, through the way the light bent and died around it. The vibration reached a crescendo. Ethan felt pressure in his chest, a crushing weight that made breathing difficult. His thoughts slowed, stretched, as though time itself were being pulled apart. Within that pressure was an unmistakable awareness. The thing beneath the house knew him. Not as an individual, not as a person with a name or history, but as a pattern. A resource. A necessary component in a process older than language. His fear, his curiosity, his gradual isolation. All of it had been shaped, encouraged, cultivated. He had not found the staircase by accident. The staircase had been growing toward him. Ethan backed away, instinct finally screaming loud enough to cut through the influence pressing against his mind. He turned and ran, the hum surging behind him like a tide. The grooves in the floor seemed to deepen as he passed, the stone softening beneath his feet, trying to pull him off balance. The staircase appeared ahead, its steps rising into darkness. He climbed. The steps resisted now, their surfaces shifting underfoot, angles changing just enough to force missteps. The markings along the walls pulsed violently, their patterns strobing in disorienting rhythms that made it difficult to focus. The vibration followed him, relentless, the sense of pursuit undeniable. Halfway up, the air thickened to the point of suffocation. Each breath felt earned, dragged into his lungs against invisible resistance. his muscles burned, his vision narrowed, the edges of the world dimming. The staircase stretched. The distance between steps increased, forcing him to lunge awkwardly upward. Below him, the darkness surged, rising faster than he climbed, the hum resolving into a deeper resonance that felt almost like satisfaction. Ethan reached the point where the basement should have been. There was no opening. Above him was only more stone, the staircase continuing upward into a void that should not exist. Panic clawed at him, sharp and desperate. He spun, searching for any sign of escape. The markings along the walls shifted. They rearranged themselves into patterns that felt deliberate, guiding his gaze downward toward the darkness below. The vibration intensified, pressing against his skull, filling his thoughts with a single, overwhelming impression. Return. Ethan screamed, the sound torn from his throat, but it vanished almost immediately, swallowed by the stone. He climbed harder, scraping his hands raw against the walls, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Then, without warning, the staircase ended. He stumbled forward and collapsed onto concrete. Basement concrete. The familiar smell of dust and damp earth hit him like a wave. The basement light burned steadily overhead, illuminating the ordinary, unfinished space he knew. Behind him, the stone staircase was gone, replaced once again by solid floor. Ethan lay there, sobbing silently, his body racked with exhaustion and shock. He did not move for a long time. When he finally did, it was with slow, careful motions, as though the slightest misstep might tear the illusion apart. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Days passed. Then weeks. Ethan never went into the basement again. He tried once to leave the house. This time the car started. He made it to the highway. The dizziness did not come. The road stretched ahead, open and ordinary. Relief flooded him so intensely it made his hands shake on the steering wheel. He did not notice the staircase at first. It appeared in his peripheral vision, a faint impression reflected in the rearview mirror. Stone steps descending where the back seat should have been. He looked again and it was gone. From that day on, the staircase followed him. It appeared in reflections, in dark windows, in the corners of rooms when the light was just wrong. He would open a closet and glimpse stone steps vanishing downward before the space resolved into something normal again. He would wake at night with the certainty that he was standing at the top of it, poised to descend. The dreams returned, more vivid than ever. He dreamed of houses growing like shells around unseen cores. Of people drawn downward, their lives narrowing until the descent felt inevitable. Of the thing beneath the stairs, patient and vast, extending its influence outward through cracks in reality, through structures and habits and quiet moments of weakness. Ethan understood then that escape had been an illusion. The house had let him go because it no longer needed him there. The staircase had already been built somewhere deeper inside him, a mental architecture shaped by exposure and understanding. He carried it now wherever he went. Months later, a new family moved into the house. The listing mentioned a finished basement. Fresh concrete. No history of structural issues. A good price. On their first night, the light in the basement turned on by itself. And somewhere, far below, something old and patient began to stir.